Petrosian seems to violate one of the fundamental rules of chess strategy in this game played in 1950 against Peter Vasilyevich Dubinin at the USSR Championship. Petrosian would have been around 21, and he really plays some very creative chess, very instructional chess in this game. He has the black pieces. Dubinin has white. Let us jump right in. Dubinin begins with e4 and e6 from Petrosian. And he didn't play the French defense very often, but this does lead to the kind of locked pawn structures he tended to enjoy. Knight to c3 and bishop to b4, pinning the knight at c3. And after e5, knight to e7, a3, he goes ahead and takes that knight. This is the winner variation. Pawn takes bishop, and this is a very strange opening. Black has given up what was maybe his best minor piece, his dark-squared bishop. This bishop at c8 is blocked in by the pawn at e6. But he did it to wreck the pawn structure of white here at c3 and c2. Now he's going to play c5, try to get at those pawns down the c-file. This pawn at g7 is now undefended because the bishop at f8 is left. So white immediately plays queen to g4 to attack that pawn. Black can castle here and try to defend against the attack. That's a playable move. The main move here is queen to c7, allowing that pawn to be taken, playing what's known as the winner poisoned pawn variation. But Petrosian plays something a little different. He plays the less common knight to f5, putting the knight on a nice square and defending the g7 pawn. White immediately plays bishop to d3, threatening to take the knight and then take the g7 pawn. Petrosian responds with h5, kicking the queen away. Queen goes to h3, just sort of keeping an eye on this knight at f5. Now, Petrosian takes on d4. He wants to open up the c-file for potential counterplay. White plays a creative move here. He plays g4, taking advantage of the pin on the h-file and wanting to kick this knight at f5 away. It's on a nice square, so it moves back to e7. Now white takes back on d4 and queen to c7 from Petrosian. Now, the threat is queen to c3 check, attacking the king and the rook at the same time, winning the rook. So white plays knight to e2 to defend the c3 square. Knight to c6, knight b to c6, threatening knight takes d4. And if the knight were to retake, then playing queen to c3 check, that motif remains. So white goes ahead and castles. Now there's no check on c3, so that tactic is off of the board. Petrosian completes his development, bishop to d7. White goes ahead and takes on h5, and long castling. Now, here we see Petrosian violate one of the main strategic rules in chess, and that rule is you want to attack on the side of the board where you have more space. There's also a rule that says you want to attack where the direction your pawns point. That would indicate black wants to attack on the queen side and white on the king side. But Petrosian decides to attack on the king side, where it looks like he's a bit weaker. And you may say, well, that's because there's a weakness here. That's part of it. But actually, I think he would have wanted to attack on the king side anyway. That's one of the paradoxes of the winnower variation, is that black will attack on the side of the board where he has less space. And after bishop f4, Petrosian plays rook d to g8, lining up his pieces, trying to put pressure on the king side. The king moves to the side h1 to get away from the stare of that rook. And now g5, hitting the bishop, and Dubinin cannot take the pawn en passant because he would lose his queen. So there's a pin there. So the bishop goes back to g3, and now rook to h6, planning to double on the h-file and grab the h5 pawn. f4 and g4 and queen to g2, leaving a fairly nice square for a knight here at f5, which Petrosian immediately jumps into. And looking at this, you might say, well, can't white take the knight? After pawn takes bishop, queen takes d5. The problem with that is black will get way too much play on the light squares. Enough to, white would just be probably lost after that. So Dubinin does not try to win a pawn that way. Queen to f2. Petrosian grabs his pawn. Rook f to c1. So if black's attacking on the king side, white needs to attack on the queen side, and he prepares the move c4 to open up lines against the king and the queen here. Petrosian plays knight to a5 to keep that c4 square under check, but white has to do something. He has to open up lines. So he goes ahead and plays c4 anyway, knowing he's going to lose a pawn, but just trying to open up lines. Pawn takes, and now d5. And this is an interesting position. Black cannot take the bishop because there's a pin against the queen. White is threatening to take on a7, and also this d5 pawn is, if it goes to d6, it would create a lot of problems potentially for black. So how does Petrosian deal with all of this? Well, he goes ahead and takes the pawn. Notice the knight is now completely defended by the bishop and the rook, so he goes ahead and takes that pawn. White responds with queen to a7, but now knight to c6, which hits the queen and also removes this pin. So now Petrosian is threatening to take the queen and the bishop, which basically forces queen to a8 check. And then queen to b8, and that forces queens off of the board. And now this bishop has to do something. And we see the white has the bishop pair, but Petrosian's knights are better. So bishop takes f5, bishop takes f5, and we have opposite colored bishops here. And in an endgame, they can have drawish tendencies, but that is definitely not the case here. Petrosian's light squared bishop is far stronger than white's dark squared bishop. It could even go to e4 and create some pressure against the white king. The king moves to g1. The rook moves to h8, doubling, and it looks like this pawn is sufficiently defended, and for the moment it is, but there could be some tactics there later if the white is not careful. Rook to d1, applying direct pressure to the pawn at d5, and here Petrosian plays bishop to d3. He doesn't defend the pawn directly, but he interferes, puts his bishop in the way, and also attacks the knight at e2 at the same time. Rook to a2 to defend that knight, and d4. So Petrosian has used his kingside pressure to create a formidable central pawn formation. And white, looking at these pawns, realizes he could be in big trouble very, very quickly. So he makes a good and practical decision here. He plays rook 2 to d2, and the idea is he's going to give up a rook for a bishop and pawn here. A good practical choice. The rook goes to d8, and he goes ahead and takes that bishop. Pawn takes, rook takes, king to c8. Now, here white plays bishop to f2, and it looks like he's going to get that second pawn. I mean, there are 3 attackers on that pawn. Black has 2 defenders and no real way to add a 3rd defender. But Petrosian had seen this position and knew how to defend the pawn with this move, rook to h3, directly challenging the rook on the d3 square. Obviously, the rook can't take the pawn because then the knight would take the rook. That would be a bad exchange for white. Otherwise, the rook would have to move and the pawn would advance. And he doesn't exchange rooks. Instead, he just moves the bishop back to that awful g3 square. Here white plays king to d7, which looks like an optical illusion. He's blocking the rook's defense of the pawn, so it looks like white could just take the pawn and be fine. However, if he were to take the pawn, then Petrosian would just play king to e8, and now there's a pin, and he would win material. But there is a pin down this d file, and the pawn is pinned against black's king, and so white plays a nice idea. He plays knight to c3. Then obviously, the knight cannot be taken because of that pin, and the knight's aiming for e4, where it will hit d6 and f6, 2 very nice potential squares for that knight. Petrosian plays the king to e6, and now knight to e4, aiming at those 2 nice squares. And after king to f5, white plays knight to d6 check. And this is the beautiful knight. And there's sort of a rule of thumb: if a knight is firmly entrenched on the 6th rank, then it's worth at least a rook, and maybe more. So Petrosian feels that he's obligated to do what white has already done, which is give up an exchange. So he goes ahead and takes that powerful knight off of the board. Pawn takes, and rook to h6. So we can kind of assess this position sort of using general principles. First, Petrosian's knight is much better than this bishop. This is a terrible bishop. He's going to be up a pawn here after the rook takes on d6. And very importantly, Petrosian has a more active king. So he's accumulated these little advantages. giving him a clear edge here. Rook goes to b3, rook takes d6, but now white goes ahead and takes on b7, and this looks a little troublesome for black. It looks like white is threatening to take on f7 with check, and he is, but Petrosian just ignores that. He just goes ahead and plays d3, and the reason is this: if white were to take on f7 with check here, just the king goes to g6, excuse me, hitting that rook, and if the rook moves, then d2, and he would have to give up his rook for the newly formed queen. So because of that, white does not have time to take on f7 and returns back to b1. d2, threatening now to queen. So the rook goes to d1 to stop the pawn from advancing, but now king to e4, the well-placed king begins to march, and he would love to come in here and go to c2 and annoy that rook at d1. So in response, king to f2, king to d3, and now white plays f5. The bishop is directly attacking the rook, so the rook just moves. Rook to d4. Here, white, seeing the writing on the wall, he plays h3, but then after king to c2, white resigned. The reason is pretty obvious. If this rook moves, black will just queen, and the rook will have to give itself up for the queen. And if he tries to defend with the king to e2, then rook to e4 check would push the king away, and Petrosian would win the rook. Really an interesting and rich game from Petrosian. You can see the contours of his future greatness. Obviously, he became world champion with the exchange sacrifice and the understanding of how to make knights better than bishops, and just a beautiful game. I hope you've enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.